They treated her like a nervous trainee who needed help with basic tasks. The senior crew smiled with patient condescension as she served coffee and checked seat belts. But when the engines exploded at 37,000 feet and the pilots lost control, she revealed a call sign that made F-22 pilots freeze in shock. Maya Chen walked through the crew briefing room at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with her brand new flight attendant uniform perfectly pressed and her identification badge still shiny from the lamination process. The other crew members barely glanced at her as she took her seat for the pre-flight briefing, their expressions showing the familiar mixture of polite indifference and slight impatience that experienced aviation professionals reserved for newcomers who would probably need extra guidance throughout the flight. She had joined the airline only 3 weeks ago, and everyone treated her exactly as they treated all new hires. Someone who needed patient explanations about procedures they had performed thousands of times. Someone who might need reminding about safety protocols and passenger service standards, someone who was still learning the difference between theoretical training and actual operational reality at 35,000 feet. Captain Robert Harrison reviewed the flight plan for their route from Dallas to Seattle while First Officer Jennifer Parks nodded along, both of them veteran pilots with combined experience exceeding 40 years in commercial aviation. The senior flight attendant, Patricia Morgan, sat beside Maya and whispered quiet reminders about the beverage service timing and the specific preferences of their regular business class passengers, speaking with the kind of gentle condescension that suggested she assumed Maya might forget these details under the pressure of actual service. Maya listened politely and nodded appropriately, asking occasional questions that made her seem eager but inexperienced, never revealing that she had once coordinated far more complex operations while flying at speeds that would make this Boeing 777 seem like it was standing still. Her previous life remained completely hidden behind her friendly smile and her careful attention to Patricia's explanations about coffee versus tea preferences and the proper way to secure the galley carts during turbulence. The passenger boarding process began exactly on schedule, and Maya took her position near the business class section, greeting travelers with warm efficiency while Patricia watched her performance with the critical eye of someone evaluating a trainee's ability to meet professional standards. Several passengers asked Maya questions about seat assignments and overhead bin space, and she answered each inquiry with helpful accuracy, though Patricia still felt compelled to step in occasionally with additional clarifications, as if Maya might not have provided complete information. The other flight attendants exchanged knowing glances that suggested they remembered their own early days of feeling overwhelmed by the constant demands and the need to project calm confidence even when uncertainty bubbled beneath the surface. Nobody suspected that Maya had once operated in environments where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, where her call sign had become legendary among combat aviators who studied her achievements during their advanced training programs. Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate with 283 passengers aboard, the massive aircraft beginning its taxi toward runway 31 left under Captain Harrison's experienced command. Maya completed her safety demonstration in the business class cabin with smooth professionalism, her movements precise and her explanations clear. Though Patricia still hovered nearby as if ready to correct any potential mistakes that might emerge from a new hire's nervousness. The takeoff proceeded normally, the powerful engines lifting the 700,000-pound aircraft into the afternoon sky above Texas, the landing gear retracting with solid mechanical precision as Dallas disappeared beneath the clouds. Maya moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and securing loose items, performing the routine tasks that seemed so simple yet required constant attention to detail, tasks that kept her true capabilities completely hidden behind the role of the helpful new girl who was still proving herself worthy of the uniform she wore. The first indication of trouble came 90 minutes into the flight, when the aircraft was cruising over Colorado at 37,000 feet, a routine segment of the journey where passengers had settled into their books and movies and meals while the crew prepared the beverage service. A sharp metallic bang echoed through the fuselage, followed immediately by violent shuddering that sent unsecured items flying across the cabin and triggered immediate alarm among the passengers, who grabbed their armrests and looked around with frightened confusion. Captain Harrison's voice came over the intercom with forced calm, explaining that they had experienced some minor technical difficulty and asking everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seat belts, though the continuing vibrations made it clear this was more than a minor issue. Maya moved through the aisle with steady purpose, helping passengers secure themselves and retrieving fallen belongings, her demeanor projecting exactly the right mixture of alertness and reassurance, even as her trained mind instantly recognized the signatures of catastrophic mechanical failure that exceeded normal commercial aviation emergencies. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison and First Officer Parks stared at their instrument panels with growing horror as multiple warning lights illuminated in rapid succession, each alert indicating failures that should never occur simultaneously during normal operations. The No. 2 engine had suffered a catastrophic turbine failure, sending shrapnel through critical hydraulic lines and severing connections to backup systems that were supposed to provide redundancy during emergencies. The aircraft's primary flight control system began displaying error messages as hydraulic pressure dropped across multiple circuits, and the backup electrical generators showed fluctuating output that suggested the engine explosion had caused more widespread damage than initially apparent. Captain Harrison's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency as he attempted to implement the emergency procedures he had trained for throughout his career, but the cascading failures kept accelerating beyond the scenarios covered in any training manual or simulator program he had ever experienced. First Officer Parks established communication with Denver Center, her voice professionally controlled despite the fear she felt building in her chest as she reported their emergency status and requested immediate vectors toward the nearest suitable airport. The air traffic controller responded with urgent clearance, directing them toward Colorado Springs Airport while simultaneously alerting emergency services and clearing all other traffic from their projected path. Captain Harrison attempted to stabilize the aircraft's flight path, but the control inputs felt increasingly mushy and unresponsive, the normal feedback through the yoke becoming vague and imprecise as hydraulic systems continued degrading. The aircraft began a slow uncommanded roll to the right, and when Harrison applied corrective aileron input, the response was sluggish and inadequate, confirming his worst fear that they were losing the ability to maintain controlled flight through normal piloting techniques. Patricia knocked urgently on the cockpit door and entered when Parks released the lock, her face pale with barely controlled panic as she reported that passengers were becoming increasingly frightened by the violent shaking and the visible smoke now trailing from the damaged engine. Captain Harrison told her to prepare the cabin for possible emergency landing procedures, though his tone suggested he was not entirely confident they would maintain enough control to reach any airport at all. Patricia returned to the cabin and began directing the flight attendants to secure all loose items and prepare passengers for emergency procedures, her voice rising slightly with stress as she tried to maintain order among increasingly terrified travelers who could see the damaged engine through their windows and smell the acrid smoke filtering through the ventilation system. Maya moved through her assigned section with calm efficiency, her actions perfectly matching the expected behavior of a new flight attendant following emergency protocols, though her eyes continuously assessed structural integrity and system performance with the kind of analytical precision that came from years of operating in far more dangerous environments. The aircraft's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next 10 minutes as additional systems failed in cascading sequence, each new malfunction compounding the previous problems and pushing the situation beyond anything Captain Harrison or First Officer Parks had encountered in their combined decades of flying. The No. 1 engine began showing abnormal vibration patterns that suggested it too had sustained damage from the initial explosion, and when Parks attempted to adjust the thrust settings, the engine responded erratically before settling into an unstable operating state that could fail completely at any moment. The hydraulic pressure continued dropping despite emergency procedures, and the flight control surfaces were becoming increasingly unresponsive to pilot inputs, the massive aircraft behaving more like a wounded bird than a sophisticated modern airliner designed with multiple redundancies and fail-safe systems. Harrison and Parks exchanged glances that communicated what they both understood but did not want to say aloud. They were rapidly approaching a point where maintaining controlled flight would become impossible using conventional piloting techniques. Denver Center contacted them with updated information about military assistance, explaining that two F-22 Raptor fighters from Buckley Air Force Base were being scrambled to provide visual assessment and tactical support during the emergency. Captain Harrison acknowledged the information while wrestling with the controls, grateful for any help but uncertain what fighter jets could actually do to assist a failing commercial airliner that was running out of options. The F-22s would reach their position within minutes, the controller explained, and the military pilots would establish direct communication to coordinate whatever assistance might be possible given the circumstances. Harrison focused on maintaining altitude and heading as best he could, while Parks continued running through emergency checklists, searching desperately for some procedure or technique that might restore enough control authority to attempt a landing. In the cabin, Patricia was struggling to maintain order as passengers sensed the growing severity of their situation, their questions becoming more insistent and their fear more visible despite the crew's attempts to project confidence and capability. Several passengers were crying openly, and others were making phone calls to family members with shaking voices that betrayed their understanding that this might be their final conversation. Patricia moved through the aisle trying to provide reassurance, but her own fear was becoming harder to hide as the aircraft's erratic movements grew more pronounced and the smoke smell intensified. She called Maya forward and asked her to help calm the passengers in the rear sections, speaking to her with the kind of urgent directive normally reserved for subordinates who needed clear instructions during crisis situations. Maya nodded and moved toward the back of the cabin, maintaining her role as the helpful new girl, even as every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to take action using capabilities that remained completely hidden beneath her flight attendant uniform. Captain Harrison's voice came over the cabin intercom again, this time without even attempting to minimize the seriousness of their situation, explaining that they had lost most of their hydraulic systems and were having extreme difficulty controlling the aircraft. He asked everyone to review the emergency card in their seat pocket and prepare for the possibility of emergency evacuation procedures upon landing, though his tone suggested he was not confident they would successfully reach any runway in their current condition. The announcement triggered renewed panic among the passengers, and Patricia found herself overwhelmed trying to manage multiple frightened travelers simultaneously while also directing the other flight attendants, who were equally stressed and uncertain. She looked around desperately for additional support and saw Maya returning from the rear cabin, moving with a kind of focused calm that seemed almost out of place given the chaos surrounding them. The F-22 Raptors appeared off their right wing, the sleek stealth fighters positioning themselves to conduct a visual assessment of the damaged commercial airliner. The lead F-22 pilot, Major Kyle Stevens, radioed Captain Harrison with his call sign, Striker 1, and requested permission to conduct close formation flying to examine the visible damage. Harrison granted permission, his attention divided between the radio communication and the increasingly unresponsive flight controls that required constant correction to prevent the aircraft from rolling into an unrecoverable spiral. Major Stevens maneuvered his F-22 into position beneath the damaged engine, his trained eyes immediately recognizing the catastrophic nature of the turbine failure and the extensive collateral damage to surrounding systems. He reported his observations to Denver Center and Captain Harrison, his professional tone not fully concealing his concern about what he was seeing. The second F-22, piloted by Captain Amanda Richardson with the call sign Striker 2, positioned herself on the opposite side to examine the aircraft from multiple angles. She reported additional concerns about fluid leaking from several locations along the wing and fuselage, suggesting the hydraulic failures were even more extensive than the cockpit instruments indicated. Major Stevens asked Captain Harrison about their control authority and flight stability, and Harrison's response was brutally honest, admitting they were losing the ability to maintain controlled flight and might not reach Colorado Springs even with maximum effort. The two F-22 pilots discussed possible options over their tactical frequency, their conversation reflecting the grim reality that there were very few good choices available when a large commercial aircraft lost its primary control systems at high altitude with nearly 300 souls aboard. In the cockpit, First Officer Parks suddenly pointed at a new warning light that made Captain Harrison's blood run cold. The remaining functional engine was now showing signs of impending failure, the vibration levels increasing beyond acceptable limits and the temperature gauges climbing toward dangerous thresholds. Harrison made the agonizing decision to reduce thrust on the failing engine, knowing this would further decrease their control authority but also recognizing that a second catastrophic engine failure could tear apart what remained of their damaged aircraft. The Boeing 777 began descending more rapidly as the reduced thrust compromised their ability to maintain altitude and the control inputs required to keep the wings level became increasingly extreme and ineffective. Parks calculated their descent rate and realized with sinking dread that they would not reach Colorado Springs. Their trajectory would bring them down somewhere over the mountainous terrain of central Colorado, where emergency landing sites were virtually non-existent. Patricia appeared at the cockpit door again, her composure finally cracking as she reported that passengers were panicking and the other flight attendants were asking what instructions they should give for brace positions and evacuation procedures. Captain Harrison told her to prepare everyone for potential impact with terrain, the words coming out with difficulty as he acknowledged the likelihood that they were all going to die in the next few minutes. Patricia's face went white and she stepped backward into the cabin, her mind refusing to fully process what she had just heard, even as her training told her she needed to prepare the passengers for the worst possible outcome. She turned toward the cabin and froze, overwhelmed by the impossible task of telling nearly 300 people they were probably about to crash. Maya stepped forward and placed a steady hand on Patricia's shoulder, her touch conveying confidence that seemed completely inappropriate for a new hire facing her first real emergency. Patricia looked at her with confusion and desperation, and Maya spoke in a voice that was still gentle but now carried undertones of absolute authority that had not been present before. She told Patricia to have all the flight attendants move passengers into brace positions and prepare the emergency exits, and then she moved past the senior flight attendant toward the cockpit with determined purpose that suggested she was no longer content to maintain her cover as the inexperienced new girl. Patricia started to object, to remind Maya that she was just a trainee who should follow instructions rather than giving them, but something in Maya's eyes stopped the words before they emerged, some quality of complete certainty that made Patricia step aside instead of asserting her seniority. Maya knocked on the cockpit door with firm insistence, and when Captain Harrison called out asking who it was, she identified herself and added words that made both pilots turn to look at the door with confusion. She told them she had relevant emergency experience and requested permission to enter the cockpit, her tone carrying professional formality that seemed completely out of place for a 3-week flight attendant trainee. Captain Harrison and First Officer Parks exchanged bewildered glances, uncertain whether to be offended by the presumption or desperate enough to accept help from any source, but the aircraft's increasingly violent shaking and the growing list of failed systems made the decision for them. Parks unlocked the door, and Maya entered, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panels with the kind of rapid assessment that only came from extensive cockpit experience. Captain Harrison started to ask what a flight attendant thought she could possibly contribute to a situation that had overwhelmed 2 veteran pilots, but Maya cut him off with quiet authority and asked for their current status in technical terms that demonstrated immediate understanding of aviation systems and aerodynamic principles. The captain's objection died in his throat as he recognized something familiar in her bearing and her language, something that suggested this woman was far more than the nervous new hire he had assumed she was during the pre-flight briefing. He quickly summarized their situation while Maya moved closer to examine the flight control panel and the hydraulic system displays, her questions becoming increasingly technical and specific as she processed information faster than Parks thought possible for someone who supposedly had no piloting experience. Maya's eyes focused on the manual reversion indicators and the remaining partial hydraulic pressure in the backup system, her mind running calculations that assessed possibilities the 2 commercial pilots had not considered because they existed outside conventional emergency procedures. She asked Captain Harrison if he had attempted differential thrust steering using the functioning engine, and he responded that they had tried but found it ineffective given their current configuration. Maya nodded and asked about the aircraft's fuel load and center of gravity, receiving immediate answers that she incorporated into her rapidly developing plan. Then she asked a question that made both pilots stare at her with complete confusion. She wanted to know if they had experience with military-style emergency recovery techniques using extreme control surface inputs combined with asymmetric thrust management. Captain Harrison asked who exactly Maya was and where she had learned about military aviation emergency procedures, his voice reflecting growing suspicion that the woman standing in his cockpit was something very different from what her flight attendant uniform suggested. Maya met his gaze steadily and explained that she needed to use emergency communication protocols to contact the F-22 pilots directly, and that she required immediate access to their radio systems to transmit specific information that would clarify her credentials and her authority to take command of the situation. Harrison hesitated for only a moment before gesturing toward the radio panel, his desperation overriding his confusion as he recognized they had nothing to lose by letting this mysterious woman try whatever she had in mind. Maya activated the emergency military frequency and transmitted with precise radio discipline, identifying herself by name and then adding her call sign in a voice that carried absolute confidence. She said, "Striker 1 and Striker 2, this is Phantom, requesting tactical support authorization under emergency combat recovery protocols." The radio fell silent for 3 long seconds, and then Major Stevens's voice came back with unmistakable shock and disbelief, asking for confirmation and verification of the call sign that every fighter pilot in the United States Air Force knew from their advanced training programs and their study of legendary combat operations. Maya repeated her call sign and added her service number and her last operational unit, information that made Captain Harrison and First Officer Parks turn to stare at her with complete bewilderment as they tried to process what they were hearing. Major Stevens transmitted again, his voice now filled with profound respect bordering on reverence, confirming that he had verified her identity through military databases and that Phantom was indeed aboard the failing commercial aircraft. He asked what she needed from the F-22 element, his tone suggesting he would do absolutely anything she requested because he understood exactly who he was talking to. Maya outlined her requirements with rapid precision, requesting the F-22s provide visual feedback on control surface movement during her recovery attempts, monitor their flight path for ground clearance, and relay real-time data to Colorado Springs Emergency Services about their probable touchdown location. Major Stevens acknowledged every instruction and positioned his Raptor to provide optimal observation angles, while Captain Richardson moved Stryker 2 into a supporting position that would allow coordinated surveillance of the damaged airliner's condition. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison demanded to know what was happening and who Maya really was, his voice rising with frustration and confusion as he watched this supposed new higher flight attendant take command of his aircraft and coordinate with military fighters as if she had every right to do so. Maya turned to face him and explained with quiet intensity that she was a retired Air Force combat pilot who had flown special operations missions and developed emergency recovery techniques that existed outside standard commercial aviation procedures. She told him that her call sign, Phantom, had been earned during operations where conventional piloting methods would have resulted in mission failure and loss of the aircraft, and that she had successfully recovered damaged fighters under conditions most pilots considered unsurvivable. She asked if he was willing to transfer control authority to her so she could attempt recovery techniques that required precise coordination and extreme control inputs that would feel completely wrong to anyone trained in commercial aviation standards. Captain Harrison looked at First Officer Parks, seeing his own desperation reflected in her eyes, and then looked back at Maya with the expression of a man who had just been thrown a lifeline he did not fully understand. He asked what would happen if he refused, and Maya answered honestly that they would continue their current descent until they impacted terrain in approximately 8 minutes, killing everyone aboard through a perfectly professional but completely unsuccessful application of standard emergency procedures. Harrison held her gaze for another 3 seconds, then nodded and formally transferred control of the aircraft to her, moving his hands away from the controls while telling Parks to monitor systems and provide whatever support Maya requested. Maya took the captain's seat with smooth efficiency, her hands immediately moving to the controls with practiced familiarity that made it clear she had spent thousands of hours in command positions despite her current role as the airline's newest flight attendant. The first thing she did was reduce their descent rate using a combination of partial hydraulic control and asymmetric thrust manipulation that created artificial stability through methods that existed completely outside commercial pilot training programs. She used tiny inputs on the working control surfaces combined with precise thrust adjustments that generated differential forces, creating a kind of dynamic equilibrium that arrested their descent temporarily while she assessed their options. Captain Harrison watched with growing amazement as techniques he had never imagined possible actually produced measurable results, the aircraft's wild rolling tendency diminishing slightly as Maya found the exact combination of inputs that worked within their catastrophically damaged configuration. She transmitted to Major Stevens, asking for real-time feedback on how her control surface movements were actually translating into aircraft response, since the cockpit indicators were no longer reliable. Major Stevens provided continuous commentary from his observation position, describing exactly what he saw happening with the wings and tail surfaces as Maya experimented with different input combinations. His professional pilot's eye could identify movements invisible to the damaged aircraft's own sensors, and his real-time information allowed Maya to refine her technique with precision that would have been impossible without external visual reference. She asked Captain Richardson and Stryker 2 to identify potential landing sites within their reduced range, requesting information about any flat areas that might support an emergency touchdown, even without proper runway facilities. Richardson began scanning the terrain ahead, her advanced sensors identifying several possibilities while she simultaneously calculated approach vectors that might work given the commercial aircraft's limited maneuverability. Maya began executing a controlled turn toward the most promising landing site Richardson had identified, a relatively flat valley about 40 miles ahead that offered several thousand feet of open terrain suitable for an emergency landing. The turn required coordination between thrust, rudder, and aileron that seemed to violate everything Captain Harrison understood about aircraft control, but somehow Maya made the inputs work together to produce the desired heading change without losing too much altitude or triggering the uncontrollable roll they had been fighting. She explained to Harrison and Parks what she was doing as she worked, describing how combat damage recovery required thinking about aircraft control as a dynamic balance of forces rather than a simple relationship between control inputs and desired responses. She told them about missions where she had brought damaged aircraft home using similar techniques, flying fighters that had lost hydraulics or suffered battle damage that eliminated normal control authority. Patricia's voice came over the intercom, asking what was happening and whether they should prepare for imminent impact, her tone desperate and terrified as the passengers' panic reached critical levels. Maya keyed the cabin microphone and spoke with calm authority that projected confidence throughout the aircraft, explaining that they were executing advanced emergency recovery procedures and that everyone should remain in brace position while trusting the flight crew to bring them down safely. Her voice carried such absolute certainty that even the most frightened passengers felt their panic recede slightly, replaced by fragile hope that perhaps they might actually survive. Patricia listened from the cabin and felt her own terror diminish as she recognized something in Maya's tone that transcended normal flight attendant training, some quality of command presence that came from leading people through genuinely dangerous situations and bringing them home alive. The aircraft continued descending toward the valley Richardson had identified, and Maya began configuring their approach using every remaining functional system while working around the catastrophic failures that had defeated conventional recovery attempts. She extended partial flaps using emergency backup systems that most commercial pilots did not even know existed, creating just enough additional lift to reduce their sink rate without triggering additional stress on the damaged structure. She asked Major Stevens to describe their actual flight path relative to the terrain, knowing the cockpit instruments were providing unreliable altitude information that could lead them into controlled flight into terrain if she trusted them blindly. Stevens became her eyes and her altitude reference, providing continuous updates about clearance above ridges and elevation above the valley floor as Maya guided the massive airliner toward emergency touchdown. The final approach required flying techniques that would have looked completely wrong to any airline check pilot watching from the ground. Maya used aggressive side-slip maneuvers to control descent rate while maintaining enough forward speed to preserve control authority, her hands moving constantly on the controls to counter the aircraft's tendency to roll unpredictably. Captain Harrison wanted to offer suggestions or corrections but forced himself to remain silent as he watched Maya perform a kind of aerial ballet that managed to keep them moving in approximately the right direction despite having almost no normal control capability. First Officer Parks called out altitude and airspeed as best she could determine from instruments she no longer fully trusted, her voice tight with tension as she watched the valley floor rising toward them at speeds that seemed too fast for any survivable landing. Maya transmitted to Striker 1 and Striker 2, thanking them for their support and asking them to relay final position information to rescue services because she would be too busy in the next minute to communicate with anyone. Major Stevens acknowledged and told her that every fighter pilot in the Air Force would be honoring her memory if this went badly, his voice breaking slightly as he struggled with the emotions of watching a legendary aviator possibly about to die. Maya responded with dry humor that she had no intention of becoming a memorial anecdote, and that she would appreciate it if he bought her a drink after the rescue crews finished their work. Then she focused entirely on the landing sequence, her world narrowing to the controls in her hands and the rapidly approaching ground that would either support their survival or end 300 lives in the next 30 seconds. The Boeing 777 touched down in the valley with violent force that shattered the landing gear and sent debris flying in all directions, but Maya kept the wings level using techniques that prevented the aircraft from cartwheeling or breaking apart during the initial ground contact. The fuselage screeched across rocky terrain while metal tore and engines separated from their mountings, but the passenger compartment remained largely intact as Maya used differential braking and asymmetric thrust to keep them moving in something resembling a straight line. Fire erupted from the separated engines and hydraulic fluid ignited in spectacular flames, but the emergency fuel dump she had executed during final approach had minimized the available combustible material that could have transformed the crash site into an inferno. The aircraft finally ground to a halt after sliding nearly 1,000 feet, broken and destroyed but still recognizable as an airplane rather than scattered wreckage. Maya immediately ordered evacuation through the cabin intercom, her voice cutting through the passengers, shock and confusion with commands that triggered automatic responses even from people too dazed to think clearly. Patricia and the other flight attendants deployed emergency slides and began directing passengers toward exits, their training overcoming their trauma as they focused on getting everyone away from the burning wreckage. Captain Harrison and First Officer Parks sat frozen in their seats for several seconds, unable to process what had just happened, before Maya physically pulled them from their chairs and pushed them toward the cockpit escape hatch. She stayed behind to verify all passengers were evacuating, moving through the tilted cabin, checking seats while smoke began filling the interior, her priority entirely focused on ensuring every single person got out alive. The last passengers cleared the emergency slides and scattered across the valley floor just as the fire spread toward the fuselage, and Maya finally exited through the rear galley door moments before flames engulfed that section of the aircraft. She stumbled away from the burning wreckage and fell to her knees in the dirt, her body suddenly responding to the massive adrenaline released now that immediate danger had passed. Patricia ran toward her and dropped down beside her, asking if she was injured, but Maya shook her head and looked around to count the people scattered across the valley. Captain Harrison approached with First Officer Parks, both of them staring at Maya as if seeing her for the first time, their expressions mixing gratitude, bewilderment, and profound respect for this woman they had dismissed as an inexperienced new hire just hours earlier. The F-22 Raptors circled overhead as rescue helicopters began arriving with emergency medical teams, and Major Stevens transmitted congratulations to Phantom for achieving what he called the most remarkable emergency landing he had witnessed in his entire military career. Maya used Harrison's radio to thank the fighter pilots for their essential support, acknowledging that she could never have succeeded without their real-time information and tactical coordination. Stevens asked if she would accept a personal meeting after the rescue operations concluded, explaining that he and every pilot in his squadron would consider it a profound honor to shake hands with the legendary aviator whose combat achievements had inspired their own development as military pilots. Maya agreed with quiet humor, suggesting they could meet at whatever bar was closest to wherever the rescue teams transported the survivors. Patricia sat beside Maya in the dirt and finally asked the question every crew member was thinking. Who was Maya really, and why had she been working as a new flight attendant when she possessed capabilities that exceeded anything they had imagined possible? Maya explained with gentle honesty that she had retired from the Air Force after completing missions she could not discuss in detail, and that she had taken the airline job because she missed being around aircraft and serving passengers, even if the work was different from her previous career. She admitted that she had deliberately concealed her military background because she wanted to prove herself through normal performance rather than trading on past achievements, and because she genuinely enjoyed working as a flight attendant without the weight of expectations that came with her legendary reputation. Patricia listened with tears streaming down her face, understanding finally that the patient new girl she had been condescending to all morning was someone whose courage and skill had just saved her life and the lives of everyone aboard. The rescue helicopters began evacuating injured passengers while emergency vehicles arrived carrying medical supplies and equipment, their crews working with organized efficiency to provide immediate care and transport everyone to proper hospital facilities. Captain Harrison stood near Maya and formally thanked her for taking command when he had failed, acknowledging that his conventional training had been completely inadequate for the catastrophic failures they had experienced. Maya told him that he had made the right decision by trusting her even when nothing made sense, and that his willingness to transfer authority had been the crucial factor that gave them any chance of survival. She explained that most pilots would have refused to relinquish control even while dying, unable to overcome their training and accept that unconventional approaches might offer solutions when conventional methods failed completely. The emergency responders completed their initial triage and confirmed what seemed impossible given the violence of the crash landing. Every passenger and crew member had survived, with injuries ranging from minor to serious but none immediately life-threatening. The news spread through the crowd of survivors, producing reactions that ranged from hysterical laughter to sobbing relief as people realized they were actually alive despite the burning wreckage and the shattered aircraft scattered across the valley. Patricia hugged Maya with fierce gratitude, no longer caring about crew hierarchy or experience levels, seeing only the woman who had somehow brought them through disaster when death had seemed absolutely certain. The other flight attendants gathered around Maya with similar expressions of profound thanks, their earlier dismissive attitudes toward the new girl completely replaced by reverence and respect. Major Stevens landed his F-22 at a nearby military installation and immediately drove to the crash site, arriving while rescue operations were still in progress. He located Maya among the crowd of survivors and approached with military bearing that shifted to genuine emotion as he stood before her. He introduced himself properly and said that studying her classified combat missions had been a highlight of his advanced training, that the techniques she had developed in the operations she had led represented the absolute pinnacle of military aviation achievement. He told her that being able to provide support during her emergency landing was something he would remember for the rest of his career, that watching Phantom in action, even under catastrophic circumstances, had been a masterclass in aviation excellence that would inform his own flying forever. Maya thanked him with sincere appreciation, explaining that his observations from the F-22 had provided critical information she could not have obtained any other way, and that his tactical support had been absolutely essential to the successful outcome. News media began arriving at the crash site within hours, their helicopters circling while reporters tried to understand how a commercial airliner had survived a catastrophic failure that should have resulted in total loss. Initial reports focused on pilot skill and emergency procedures, standard narratives that made sense within conventional understanding of aviation accidents. But then military sources confirmed the involvement of F-22 fighters and mentioned the call sign Phantom, and aviation journalists who understood that reference realized they were reporting on something far more remarkable than a successful emergency landing. The story evolved rapidly as details emerged about the legendary combat pilot who had been working as a new flight attendant and had taken command during the crisis, revealing skills and techniques that existed in classified files and advanced military training programs rather than commercial aviation manuals. Captain Harrison gave multiple interviews describing how Maya had saved everyone aboard by implementing recovery methods he had never imagined possible, acknowledging freely that he had been seconds from giving up when she had stepped forward with solutions that proved effective despite violating everything he understood about aircraft control. First Officer Parks supported his account with technical details about the aircraft's condition and the impossibility of what Maya had accomplished using conventional approaches. Patricia and the other flight attendants added their perspectives about discovering that their new girl was actually someone whose capabilities exceeded their combined experience by orders of magnitude, their voices reflecting the complex emotions of gratitude, humility, and amazement that came from being saved by someone they had been treating with gentle condescension just hours before. The airline's executives arrived at the hospital where survivors were being treated and evaluated, their initial focus on liability and public relations shifting rapidly as they understood the remarkable nature of what had occurred. The CEO personally met with Maya and offered profound thanks for her heroic actions, acknowledging that she had preserved not only 300 lives but also the airline's reputation and future viability by preventing a catastrophic accident that would have destroyed public confidence. He asked what the airline could do to recognize her achievements and honor her service, suggesting promotions or special assignments or whatever accommodation she might request. Maya listened politely and explained that she had enjoyed working as a flight attendant and hoped to continue in that role once she recovered from the day's excitement, that she had no desire for special treatment or positions that would separate her from the normal crew community she had appreciated even during her brief tenure. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate investigation into the aircraft failure, their teams examining the wreckage to understand the sequence of malfunctions that had created the catastrophic emergency. Their initial findings confirmed Captain Harrison's assessment that the cascading failures had exceeded anything covered by standard emergency procedures, representing a combination of circumstances that would have overwhelmed even the most experienced commercial pilots using conventional recovery techniques. The investigators interviewed Maya extensively about the method she had employed, recognizing that her approach contained lessons that could inform future training programs and emergency protocols, even if implementing them required significant rethinking of established aviation doctrines. She provided detailed explanations while carefully navigating the classified aspects of her military experience, offering enough information to support safety improvements without compromising operational security. Major Stevens arranged a meeting between Maya and his entire squadron at Buckley Air Force Base, inviting her to address the fighter pilots who had studied her achievements and trained according to principles she had helped develop through her legendary combat operations. She stood before 24 F-22 pilots who represented the Air Force's elite aviators and spoke honestly about the challenges of maintaining skills and purpose after leaving military service. She told them about choosing to work as a flight attendant, not because she lacked other options, but because staying around aircraft and serving passengers provided meaning even without the intensity and importance of combat missions. She explained that the emergency landing had reminded her why she had dedicated her life to aviation, that using her capabilities to save lives validated all the training and sacrifice and risk she had accepted during her military career. The squadron presented Maya with a custom flight jacket displaying her Phantom Call sign and the date of the emergency landing, their gesture recognizing her as an honored member of the fighter pilot community regardless of her current civilian status. Major Stevens privately thanked her again for demonstrating techniques that had only existed theoretically in their training materials, explaining that witnessing her practical application of those methods under actual emergency conditions had provided insights that would improve their own capabilities. He asked if she would consider consulting with Air Force training programs, sharing her knowledge and experience with the next generation of combat aviators who would face their own impossible situations and need unconventional solutions to survive. Maya agreed to explore that possibility while maintaining her airline employment, recognizing that both roles offered opportunities to contribute meaningfully to aviation safety and excellence. Patricia visited Maya in the hospital, where she was being held for observation despite having sustained only minor injuries during the evacuation. The senior flight attendant sat beside Maya's bed and apologized with genuine emotion for treating her with condescension, for assuming incompetence based solely on new hire status, for failing to recognize the extraordinary person working beside her during their brief time together. Maya accepted the apology with gracious understanding, explaining that she had deliberately created that perception and could not fault anyone for accepting the persona she had presented. She told Patricia that the gentle guidance and patient instructions had actually been appreciated, that being treated as a normal new employee had provided a welcome contrast to her previous life, where expectations and reputation created constant pressure to maintain legendary standards. The passengers organized a gathering to personally thank Maya and the crew for bringing them home safely, their event drawing hundreds of family members who wanted to express gratitude for the survival of their loved ones. Maya attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with being celebrated but understanding that people needed some way to process their trauma and express their feelings. She stood before the crowd and acknowledged their thanks while redirecting attention to Captain Harrison, First Officer Parks, and all the flight attendants who had maintained order and executed evacuation procedures perfectly despite their own terror. She emphasized that survival had required contributions from everyone aboard, that her role had been only one part of a larger collective effort that succeeded because people trusted each other and worked together when circumstances exceeded anyone's individual capabilities. Several passengers approached Maya privately to share how her calm voice during final approach had given them courage to face potential death with some dignity, how her absolute certainty in the cabin announcement had allowed them to hope even when hope seemed irrational. A mother with 2 young children hugged Maya while crying, explaining that she had been preparing to die and trying to comfort her terrified kids when Maya's voice came over the intercom and somehow made survival seem possible again. Maya held the woman and felt her own emotions finally breaking through the professional detachment she had maintained since taking control in the cockpit, understanding viscerally that 300 lives had continued because she had possessed specific skills and had been willing to use them when circumstances demanded. The airline eventually convinced Maya to accept a position as a training consultant focusing on emergency procedures and crew resource management, a role that would allow her to share insights while still working occasional flights as a regular crew member. She developed training modules that incorporated lessons from military aviation emergency recovery, teaching commercial pilots to think beyond standard checklists when facing catastrophic failures that exceeded conventional responses. Her approach emphasized adapting to actual conditions rather than rigidly following prescribed procedures, recognizing that survival sometimes required accepting uncomfortable solutions and trusting unconventional techniques when familiar methods proved inadequate. Captain Harrison took early retirement after the incident, acknowledging honestly that experiencing such complete failure followed by witnessing Maya's success had changed his perspective on his own capabilities and limitations. He told Maya privately that watching her work had been simultaneously inspiring and humbling, that understanding how much he did not know despite decades of experience had made him question whether he could continue flying with the same confidence he had possessed before. Maya talked with him for hours about how every pilot faced situations beyond their training eventually, how recognizing limits and asking for help represented wisdom rather than weakness, how the real measure of a pilot was choosing passenger survival over personal ego. Harrison listened and eventually decided to become an instructor himself, teaching new pilots about crew resource management and the importance of accepting unconventional solutions when conventional approaches failed. First Officer Parks remained with the airline and requested Maya as her regular training partner whenever their schedules allowed coordination, wanting to learn directly from someone whose capabilities had proven so dramatically superior under actual emergency conditions. The two women developed a strong professional friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of aviation's demands and rewards. Parks told Maya that she hoped someday to possess even a fraction of the skill and confidence that Phantom had demonstrated when taking control of the failing aircraft, and Maya responded that Parks had already shown the most important quality by being willing to learn and adapt rather than defending her existing knowledge as complete. Patricia transferred to the training department, where she worked with Maya developing improved emergency procedures and crew coordination protocols, her own experience during the crisis providing valuable perspective on how flight attendants could better support pilots during catastrophic failures. She often told new hires about working with Maya and learning only during the emergency that her new girl was actually a legendary military aviator, using the story to emphasize that assumptions about people based on surface appearances could blind you to extraordinary capabilities hiding beneath ordinary roles. She taught her students to respect everyone regardless of experience level or position, because you never knew when the quiet person beside you might possess exactly the skills needed to save your life. The F-22 community adopted several of Maya's emergency recovery techniques into their own training programs after Air Force safety investigators confirmed that her methods had practical applications for fighter operations. Major Stevens led the effort to document and formalize approaches that had previously existed only as theoretical possibilities or classified operational reports. He maintained regular contact with Maya and eventually convinced her to participate in several advanced training sessions, where she demonstrated techniques to fighter pilots who would carry her lessons forward into their own combat operations. The respect and gratitude evident in those sessions reminded Maya why she had pursued military aviation originally, because the work truly mattered and the skills genuinely saved lives, even when most people never knew about the missions or the aviators who flew them. Maya continued working as a flight attendant on regular commercial flights, appreciating the routine and the normal interactions with passengers who had no idea about her background or capabilities. She enjoyed the simplicity of serving meals and answering questions about arrival times and helping families manage children during long flights, these ordinary tasks providing satisfaction precisely because they did not require the intense focus in life or death decision-making that had defined her military career. Occasionally, passengers or crew members recognized her from news coverage and asked about the emergency landing, and she answered their questions politely while gently steering conversations back to present circumstances rather than past heroics. The call sign Phantom became permanently associated with that emergency landing in aviation communities, the story spreading through pilot networks and training programs as an example of how unconventional thinking and exceptional skill could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Young aviators studied the incident and tried to understand the techniques Maya had employed, though most instructors acknowledged that duplicating her performance required not just knowledge but also the kind of profound mastery that came only from years of operating at the absolute edge of aircraft capabilities. Maya herself emphasized in interviews and training sessions that survival had depended not on individual heroics but on teamwork, between herself and the F-22 pilots, Captain Harrison's willingness to transfer control, Patricia's effective cabin management, and dozens of other factors that created the possibility of success. The valley where Flight 2847 had made its emergency landing became a minor pilgrimage site for aviation enthusiasts and survivors who wanted to see where 300 lives had been saved through a combination of skill, technology, luck, and courage. Local authorities installed a memorial marker acknowledging the event and honoring the crew and the military support that had enabled survival against improbable odds. Maya visited the site once, standing alone on the rocky ground where her aircraft had finally stopped sliding, remembering the terror and the focus and the desperate hope that her calculations and her techniques would prove adequate when tested against reality's unforgiving physics. The incident eventually faded from national news cycles as newer stories displaced the remarkable emergency landing, but within aviation communities, the legend of Phantom and Flight 2847 remained vibrant and meaningful. Pilots told the story to students and colleagues, Parents shared it with children interested in aviation careers, and safety investigators referenced it when discussing crew resource management and emergency recovery beyond standard procedures. Maya returned to her normal life as much as possible, working her flights and participating in training programs and maintaining friendships with colleagues who had learned to see beyond her new higher status to recognize the extraordinary person beneath the ordinary uniform. On quiet flights, when passengers slept and the cabin lights dimmed, Maya sometimes stood in a galley and looked through the windows at clouds passing beneath the wings, thinking about the strange path that had brought her from classified combat missions to serving coffee on commercial routes. She did not regret her choices or miss her previous life with any sense of loss. Instead, she felt profound satisfaction that her skills had ultimately served the purpose she had always intended, protecting people and bringing them safely home, even when circumstances seemed to preclude survival. The call sign Phantom represented not just her past achievements but also her continuing commitment to using her capabilities wherever they might prove valuable, whether that meant executing combat operations behind enemy lines, landing a failing airliner in a remote Colorado valley, or simply ensuring passengers received good service during routine flights across ordinary skies.